Hello, this is episode 10 of the Culture and Justice Reform podcast with me, Sean B.W. Parker, and Emma Wells above me there or around us on the screen. And this week we are joined by Dr. D-E-N-N-I-S, Dennis Eady, excuse my stammer, Dennis Eady from the Cardiff University Innocence Project. As a short introduction, he'll explain some more about the Innocence Project in a minute, but they've been going for years, and they've had some success in the world of innocence projects, which professionally to take on the cases of people maintaining innocence and analyze them in a professional manner with their brilliant students, and they delegate the cases out to interested parties. As he will tell us all about, they've just published a fantastic article in Faction, which is the publication of the Falsely Accused Carers and Teachers Association, in the last 6 months publication, which we'll talk about as well, because it's an amazing piece of work. I actually first met Dennis after I was kind of convicted in 2018, and I was reaching out to people about maintaining innocence and false accusations and things as I saw it. And he was good enough to respond, and I had the case looked at by the University of South Wales, and these things have their own lives and in context. So the appeal didn't happen with them, but there are various ways of support, which is very touching for me. And before I go on too much and totally exhaust the podcast, let's meet to Dennis now. Hi, Dennis. How are you doing? Thank you for coming on.
Hello. Fine. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, great stuff. I understand. I don't suppose you could give us a brief history of the innocence projects in Britain and Cardiff, something like that.
Right. Right. Well, Innocence projects actually started in the USA and were very successful in the United States, and it was started in this country in around 2005, started by a guy called Michael Norton, who was at that time at Bristol University. Cardiff was quite involved in the initial development. My colleague Professor Julie Price, worked very closely with Michael Norton at that time, and a very large network of projects evolved, around about 30 odd projects at that time. The Cardiff project started in 2006. I was sort of taken on initially for 2 days a week, and I just sort of hung around, really. I'm now full-time. But I started in 2009. The network, as it was called, the Innocence Project Network in the UK, INUC UK it was called, INUS UK, kind of disintegrated really around about 2014, I think it was. A lot of the universities hadn't really invested sufficiently in the project to keep these things going. A lot of them were small projects run by lecturers sort of bolted on to all their lecturing responsibilities. Mm-hmm. And as a result, that was one of the reasons that gradually things folded for many. So we think there's now about a dozen such projects around the country. Many are linked to other organisations such as Appeal and Inside Justice, and they get their work through them. One or two are linked to law firms. We're pretty much independent, and we, as you say, Sean, we had some success, but actually in terms of appeals, very little. We've had 2 cases which have been overturned.
Which is good.
It's good, but when you look at the number of cases we've looked at, it's a very, very small proportion. So we always have to say when people come to us, and we get, in the last sort of year up to end of March this year, we had 81 people seeking our help. So it's about 1 to 2 a week. And that in itself engaged a lot of time. And as you mentioned, we do try and respond to everyone who writes to us, whatever the issue is. Whether we can help them or not is another matter, but we do try and at least respond to everything that comes in as far as we can.
Yeah, extremely interesting. Thank you. And it's so important as well. Valuable, the word I'm trying to say, valuable, extremely. What would you say, to what extent are Innocence projects a academic exercise for the students, which is completely valuable and should be the case, and how much is it a actual thing of attempting to get the justice to happen, which all of us think isn't happening?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it probably started pretty much as an academic thing, and sort of particularly in law schools where sort of pro bono is very important aspect of people doing law degrees. And my colleague, Professor Price, runs a whole range of pro bono things in asylum justice, mental health, rugby, legal matters, all sorts of things, really. So there is that educational aspect is quite important to the universities. I think there's quite a conflict there sometimes. And one thing, when people sign our agreement, we put this in a few years ago, I don't know whether it was the one that you would sign, Sean, but what we say is, in addition to agreeing to us looking at the case and creating the case papers, we also ask people about any kind of research and teaching and get their agreement to that, which of course they don't have to sign. But, and within that little note, we do say that our first priority is to provide a good service as good as we can to clients. The education aspect is secondary, ultimately. That's my view anyway, and that's the way we run it at Cardiff. So, for example, there has been discussions, and some universities do this, that work on the Innocence project should be part of a module towards their degree, part of the course, in other words. At Cardiff, we've always resisted that, because I think the motivation to do it has to be a willingness to engage with the problem of miscarriage of justice. I think that's the educational aspect, and it's also the motivational aspect. And if we become too concerned about education over and above the quality of service we're providing, then we're doing a disservice to clients, and that's the worst education you can give anybody. So we certainly at Cardiff, as things stand, our priority is to provide a good service and to try and change the system and help people if we can. But the education aspect is a very, very important byproduct for that.
I'd just like to, obviously it's a pro bono service that you're providing there. In the 8 years that I've been supporting the loved ones of those who have been sent to prison, wrongfully convicted, and they've turned around and said immediately, oh, we need to get a solicitor, we need to get this overturned. And the amount of money that is invested into law firms, not yourself. I'm just saying, you know, I've seen an 80-year-old woman sell a home, sell a house to do it, and then within a matter of days of handing over £20,000, she's been told nothing we can do. That's the extraordinary amount, you know, and the amount of people who've come to me and said, is this right? How you're a pro bono charity, and you've said that you've had 81 cases presented to you. For the layman sat at home as I was, at what stage in the aftermath can these people start approaching your university? Because people, the red light goes off and they go, and interesting question, and I think people are very interested to find out.
Well, yeah, I mean, first thing we say to people, actually, if you can get professional legal help rather than our student-based project, which has a very low level of success, then use that rather than us. We always say that in our initial letters to people. However, I do understand what you're saying about the money people spend is incredible. People sell their houses to spend on lawyers just to be told that you've got no grounds for appeal. We see programs about rogue traders on the television, which always focus on builders and electricians and stuff. They never focus on lawyers, and perhaps they should have a look at that, really.
All these solicitors are doing are reading through, in most cases, summing up, the judge is summing up, and they're looking for discrepancies in the law. That's all they're looking for. So they're charging £5,000 simply for that. within a matter of hours, an undergraduate can look at that and say, no, there's nothing, and it's gone. That's £5,000. Ting, ting, ting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sort of slag off.
No, we're not doing that.
Obviously, but I think there is a, shall we say, a small minority of solicitors who are actually grossly overcharging what they're doing, in my view, and it's different. And of course, not everybody's got that money, so most people haven't got the money. They haven't got thousands of pounds to spend. So I've almost lost your question now. We are obviously a free of charge service, and
the question was, at what stage do they have to CCRC, or is it, at what stage can somebody who is appalled by what's happened approach you to try and attempt to overturn the conviction? That was the question. Sorry, Dennis.
Right. Basically, for many university projects only do CCRC work. So in other words, people have already lost their appeal. We do pre-CCRC work. So anyone who's basically been convicted and has been told that they've got no grounds for appeal could, in theory, write to us. And many people do. Yeah. The problem, of course, with that, as always, is that you're already faced with a negative advice on appeal. So the problem we have then, we can't take a case to court ourselves. We don't have rights of representing people, and it would be very poorly looked upon by the Court of Appeal, I'm sure, if we did. So ultimately, if the person has never appealed, we've got to, if we do think we've found enough basis for an appeal, we've then got to find a lawyer willing to take it on and actually take it to appeal. And that's the big problem.
I didn't know that. That's really interesting. I didn't know that.
Because we can't, I suppose we could, a person could take it themselves, we could, but, you know, there was a case where a university sort of did that and it got a very bad vibe from the Court of Appeal, you know, so it doesn't do. Well, I don't think the Court of Appeal likes litigants in person or people who are represented by non-lawyers. So I think it's probably inadvisable to do it if you can possibly help it. And of course, we don't have rights of advocacy, so we're not practicing lawyers, so we can't stand up in court and represent our clients anyway. But we can provide a full report, which is, if we do examine, obviously we can't examine every case in detail because there's too many coming to us, but when we do, we at least provide some sort of report at the end, which might conclude, well, I'm sorry, but you know, really can't find any way forward. Or it might be that we think we could possibly persuade a lawyer to take us on, but it's extremely difficult to find people to do it. But yeah, to answer your question, people can come to us at any point, providing they've, I suppose, had a negative ground or lost an appeal.
So they're at the point where they've exhausted all channels when they would come to you, would you say? That you're with all like a kind of last chance saloon? To kind of
yes, in a way, yeah, in a way. And some people come to us after they've lost a CCRC application, or you know, we put in a CCRC application a few years ago, which was the person's fourth application, and we think it should have been referred. It wasn't. But, yeah,
I
so
have in front of me, but there was a recent report that came out about the CCRC, and in what is it, 27 years that they've been operating, that they've only ever won, is it 81 cases or something out of how many thousands? The numbers are here, they could be wrong, I could be exaggerating or under-exaggerating, but you know, the success rate isn't particularly high.
Well, the referral rate, actually this was announced at the UAI conference, they did give us the figures, and the referral rate overall over the 25 years is 2.5%. Yeah, it's fluctuated between 3.5 and got down to 0.7 one year, I think. So it's a low rate of referral, yeah, and about 2/3 of those are successful when they get to the Court of Appeal. But many of those cases are asylum cases, which are very, very meritorious, but they don't represent what the CCRC was exactly set up to do initially. Some are sentence appeals, some are magistrate courts appeals. A big wodge of this year's are the post office scandal cases. So the figures are a little bit hard to unravel, but there's no doubt that the referral rate is low. And that reflects the approach of the Court of Appeal. The CCRC simply respond to the Court of Appeal's approach.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a fact, isn't it? Or this is a question. Is it a fact that basically the false allegations community sort of appeal our cause is very unpopular in the public, and that's what's being responded to by the CCRC's behaviour? Because these things are so unpopular, the public doesn't want to think people are in prison innocently, or all kinds of people getting away with it, that kind of thing. Because of that, the CCRC aren't going to refer anybody, and if they did, it would open the floodgates to many, many other things happening. I'm not talking about myself here. I'm talking about what I read in the people that I write about. Am I correct in this, or is I just very cynical? What do you think?
Well, there's no doubt that if you're talking about the kind of false allegations in terms of sexual abuse cases, which I think is what you're getting at, I think.
For example, yeah.
I mean, and the referral rate is low across the board, but it is particularly low in that type of case. And that, in fact, in our recent figures, about 63% of the people writing to us are people who've been convicted of sexual abuse allegations.
63%.
63% in recent figures of people contacting us. And very, very often historically. I mean, our other piece of research, or piece of review, we don't call it research, that review that was in Faction magazine, the average time between the alleged event and conviction was 19 years. So most of these things are very historical as well.
That's an average.
That's the average. Right? So, yeah. The span was from about 3 years to about 40. But to answer your question, I don't know whether the CCRC or Court of Appeal or lawyers are necessarily biased against that kind of case. It's just It's just that kind of case is the subject of what pretty much amounts to a witch hunt at the moment. So you're getting all these convictions on the basis of almost no evidence, where it's impossible for the person accused to defend themselves. Every safeguard that existed has been removed, from the right to silence, from hearsay evidence to previous convictions, to even classically, there is every effort to take away every possible defence that people can have. This is the problem. Lawyers are, although it's not people say the complainant shouldn't be interrogated about their previous sexual history. Well, they haven't been able to do that since 1999, Criminal Justice, Youth Justice and Criminal Evidence Act. Nowadays, lawyers are not. It's not a law, but it's very clear practice in the courts that lawyers should not vigorously interrogate complainants in sexual abuse cases. So if you take a case like that, it's probably historical, so you can't really have an alibi. I'll come back to that in a moment, because it's interesting what they do if you'd have got an alibi. You can't attack the complainant in terms of what they're saying and their reputation, even their mental health or whatever. All you can say is, well, it didn't happen. So the problem, to be fair to the CCRC, is, well, and to lawyers for that matter, how can you give grounds for appeal if all you've got is an accusation, one word against another, which has been believed by the jury? You're never going to find the requirements for an appeal, which are basically fresh evidence, unless you've got a real, really bad legal anomaly. But even that probably wouldn't get you an appeal. So
it's a stitch up. It's a stitch up, is what you're saying, isn't it? I mean, that's what it sounds like.
Well, it's a stitch up in the sense that the standard of proof at trial has been abandoned. I mentioned about alibis. In some cases,
the standard of proof at trial has been abandoned.
Completely.
Thank you. Thank you.
particularly, and that's probably true of a lot of cases, but it's particularly true of cases of sexual abuse, particularly historical sexual abuse. Now, I appreciate these cases are very difficult either way, because it's very difficult to get evidence either way.
Yeah.
Now, what happens now, the extent of bias that's occurring in some of our cases, in some of our cases we've looked at, which are historical, the client has in fact had an alibi. The alibi goes along the lines, well, the accusation is that this happened in that house, in that particular building. Well, that building didn't exist at that time.
I know
Living there
I know exactly
so,
what it is.
so how do they get around that? You get around it in two ways. Firstly, they say, well, the complainant's memory, it's a long time ago, the complainant's memory is confused, you know, and memory does get mixed up. Memory is fallible over any length of time, but particularly that length of time. So they're just basically confused about that. So we can't take too much notice of that. The other thing they do is to extend the indictment a little bit. So there's a gap either side of that period where it couldn't have happened, where it could have happened. And
the indictment.
we see this kind of trick going on, you know, there's a trick in it, actually, by prosecution.
It's a trick. It's a trick.
And to give you a sort of more contemporary example of the way the rights of defendants are being taken away, you're probably familiar with the case of Liam Allen, who was a young student accused of rape. And his trial had actually started, and he had a very diligent barrister who sat up all night going through some previously undisclosed text messages and discovered evidence which effectively proved that it was a false accusation, and the trial collapsed. Now, you would have thought that the reaction to that from the public and from the authorities would be that, okay, it's really very important that we do look at the complainant's phone. Exactly the opposite has happened. The message now, the police have been told you should not look at the complainant's phone, except to a very limited degree. And I took part in a debate recently at Exeter University, which was about whether the law had anything to do with justice. And I challenged the opposition to give me an example over the last 30 years of a single piece of legislation that actually protected the rights of defendants as opposed to eroded the rights of defendants. Of course, they couldn't do it because there haven't been any. The last piece of legislation that protected the rights of defendants must have been the Criminal PACE, Criminal Evidence Act. So, and that was 1986.
Just nipping back to Liam Allen.
Sorry, Police and Criminal Evidence Act. I mentioned blank on what placement, Police and Criminal Evidence Act.
There was an inquiry that went on where they took a handful. I don't know how many cases it were, and they investigated the cases to see if there could have been any corruption or any malfeasance or whatever. And they took a handful of cases to the CPS to investigate to see if there was other cases that could have been tampered with in the same way as Liam Allen's, and of them, it was found that there was none. But I would argue that's the CPS covering their own back to say that we made a token gesture and we found that we hadn't done anything wrong, and that happens time and time again.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's probably an astute kind of observation there, as covering their backs like these people. We don't have very long left now, Dennis. Do you want to talk to us for 30 seconds about the United Against Injustice conference of a couple of weeks ago?
Yes, United Against Injustice. It's a yearly conference, although it's been off for a couple of years because of COVID. And it's a good event because it's very much a grassroots event in a sense. It's although there are professional speakers and so on, and the CCRC were there in fact, but also it gives people that are campaigning for their loved ones a chance to speak and to get together. We heard from the Jeremy Bamber campaign, for example, and also from Barbara Stone about Michael Stone, which are two very classic sort of miscarriage of justice cases, which somehow are still failing to address those cases.
Yeah.
I mean, there was Barry George, who's committed the Jill Dam murder and later cleared. His sister spoke, and she made a plea for unity, which is something we've been hearing for many years. She's absolutely right. There should be unity amongst campaigns. You know, I'd like to see JENGBA, the Joint Enterprise Group, working with FACT and so on.
Yes,
Um,
let's do that.
Absolutely.